Hello and welcome to Auto Shenanigans. How the devil are you? Have you had a good week? My name is John. Thank you very much for joining me for another exciting Great British Road journey. This week we continue to explore South Yorkshire, a small section of a once huge county before it was separated into smaller areas. So far, things have been pretty much as we'd expect. In the last episode we looked at railways, coal mines and forges, and I would have thought it'll be much the same this week, but who knows? Well, me, but in any case, let's take a journey from Penistone to Doncaster. As always, to help navigate our way around, we'll be using my 1923 Michelin guidebook, period correct maps and Penistone. Sometimes the jokes write themselves. Penistone, or Penistone. But what is the Penistone? Well, to find out, you'll have to wine and dine me first, but what of the town of Penistone? Well, in the days of my guidebook, it was a fairly small place with little over 3,000 residents, and for some reason, my guidebook points out that Penistone is 703 foot above sea level. In the old days, the town would have been a fairly busy place, with a large iron and steelworks being the main industry in the town, but today it's all new build houses. At one stage, there was a fairly sizable railway network in the town with two main lines running through. Today, only one remains open, but the one that's closed is interesting because it was known as the Woodhead route. It was the first fully electrified main line in the country, connecting Manchester to Sheffield and, of course, stopping at Penistone. Despite there being major investment, it closed to passengers after only 20 years of operation, and apparently it wasn't even a beaching thing, it was just a poor decision. My guidebook suggests that maybe we'd like to take a look at the local church, but with all of that railway closure comes some leftover railway infrastructure, and accordingly, this is the Penistone railway turntable, used to turn around locomotives making a return journey from Penistone to Huddersfield. It's said that in order to move the locomotives from the station to the turntable and back required 32 sets of points to be switched, all within a distance of a couple of 100 metres, and from what I understand, it wasn't powered. When engines were on the turntable, they'd be rotated manually by two blokes pushing. There isn't really much else going on in Penistone other than a silly name, so I've come to Stocksbridge, a small town to the south of Penistone, and it's interesting because I don't think it's changed at all in the last 100 years. Today, there's around 9,000 residents. Back then, around 9,000 residents. Today, large steelworks employing most of the town. Back then, large steelworks employing most of the town. That's about it. My guidebook doesn't make any recommendations on things to see or do because clearly this is an industrial working town. The steel industry came to Stocksbridge in the mid-1800s, where somebody purchased an old cotton mill and converted it to make steel wire and umbrella frames. Business went really well, but they realised they could increase their profits massively if they manufactured their own steel rather than buy it in. So they banged in a blast furnace and everything else to create Stocksbridge Iron and Steelworks, which ended up being larger than the town itself. Today, the Stocksbridge steel industry is just about hanging in there. To be fair, it's done quite well to survive this long, as well as several company buyouts. But the future is bleak, with huge losses announced earlier this year, and I imagine it's only a matter of time before it's closed completely and Stocksbridge can be added to the list of declining northern towns, assuming it's not on the list already. Stealing ourselves away from Stocksbridge, we're to head towards Hoyland, and to be honest, our route couldn't be any more complicated. With the modern Stocksbridge bypass, or A616, being built, it's chopped up a lot of the original road, so in places it's just not possible to follow the period correct route. No bother though, I shall do as best I can, which I've ruined immediately because I want to make a quick detour to look at some more old industry. Indeed, a short distance from Stocksbridge is Wortley Top Forge or Wortley Iron Works, a water-powered iron forge that can be traced back to the 1600s. It was abandoned in 1929, but today it's open as a tourist attraction operated by a historical trust that was set up in the 1970s to save buildings like the forge. And over the years, they've restored it as best they can to how it would have looked in 1900. Back then, the ironworks was churning out wrought iron railway axles, which it did for 70 years before closure. Although, interestingly, it's one of the few industrial sites that doesn't have its own railway connection, despite making things for railways, and all of their goods were moved around site using horse and car, even after narrow-gauge industrial railways had become commonplace. Well, I've made it to Hoyland, which, when you look it up in my guidebook, it says see Barnsley. No thanks, I can only assume my guidebook reckons you're better off in Barnsley, but I'm not so sure. If it did have any interest in Hoyland, then maybe it might have suggested we visit Low Stand, an 18th century folly and now Grade 2 listed structure. It was built on what used to be the Wentworth estate and was most likely a hunting lodge or an observation tower, whilst many sources mention that it sits at the highest point of Hoyland at 600 feet above sea level. Penistone is 703 feet, so Another pointless structure can be found a short distance to the southeast of Hoyland by way of the Needle's Eye, which is also a folly. It was built around the same time as Lowstand, but the Needle's Eye is in far better condition. It's a 14-metre high pyramid that features an archway through the middle, and as the story goes, its construction was the result of a bet. An individual claims that he could ride his coach and horses through the eye of a needle, and the structure was built to prove it. Yeah, sure. Another unsubstantiated claim is that the Needle's Eye was once the location of executions by firing squad, based on one side of the structure showing damage in line with being shot by muskets. Nice structure, bullshit stories. Anyway, as we make our way to our next destination, we pass Wombwell, which you may remember from last week. Great, moving on, and we're going to follow the B6273, which is fine to begin with, but when we reach the A6195, we have to use it because the original road has been closed off, of course, replaced by the A6195. However, whilst we can't drive along the road, it does still exist. Indeed it does, offering a 1-mile stretch of abandoned road for us to explore. It used to take this route, but as mentioned, the A6195 replaced it and it was closed. There isn't really a lot to see, but there is an old road bridge taking the road over the River Dearne, so that's something. And a short distance from here are a few more examples of changes to the road network, albeit a bit less interesting. This lay-by used to be the A635, however the road was straightened out in the interest of safety and the leftover carriageway turned into said lay-by. And it's the same situation a short distance up the road with another lay-by. The A635 delivers us into a bit of a strange area that was originally made up of 3 villages: Bolton upon Dearne, Goldsthorpe and Fernscoe. None of these are mentioned in my guidebook, and that's because they were all constructed as places for mine workers to live and mostly owned by the mining companies. These days the whole area is struggling. When everything was good, mining accounted for over 80% of the employment for the area, but they've all closed down with nothing to replace it, and the whole area has gone downhill ever since. Sorry, there's no punchline, it's just a shame. Moving on then, and we'll be continuing along the A635, which for the most part remains as per its original form. The A1M junction sort of ruins it a bit, but once that's out of the way, it's back to the old road, which takes us straight into Doncaster. Which in the days of my guidebook was a large town or small city with around 50,000 residents, many of whom would have worked within the coal industry. Of course, there's a railway works according to my guidebook, and Doncaster is also a large but unexpected player within the confectionery industry. In fact, one of Doncaster's most famous products is butterscotch. Parkinson's Confectionery was founded in Doncaster in 1848, and they're credited for coming up with butterscotch, a new type of candy at the time made by mixing treacle, brown sugar and butter. It's very similar to toffee, but it's completely different, and it's said that there's only one manufacturer still making butterscotch to the traditional recipe, based a few miles from here in Bawtry. My guidebook mentions the GNR Works, a railway works built in 1853 by the Great Northern Railway. Today it's a massive site, but back then it was even more massiver and was the main employer for the town, and pretty much every great locomotive has been made there, including the Flying Scotsman and the Mallard. In the days of my guidebook, the site covered around 200 acres and they employed over 5,000 people, but unfortunately today that's dropped to a mere few hundred, and it's looking very likely that in the not too distant future the railway works will close, bringing an end to over 170 years of railway manufacturing in Doncaster. Here's the thing, hiding in the middle of Doncaster is a collection of aircraft and the South Yorkshire Aircraft Museum, which all looks a little bit out of place, but actually its location is right in the middle of an airfield, so perhaps it makes sense after all. Looking around, you wouldn't have even thought there was ever an airfield here, but there was. It was RAF Doncaster, opened in 1916, and it would operate up until 1954. After the airfield's closure, the whole thing was put up for sale and the buildings quickly removed, and since it had grass runways, the whole thing disappeared fairly quickly. The Aircraft Museum would move to the site in the late 1990s, and since that was long after the airfield had closed, all of their display aircraft had to be trucked in. Not that they're airworthy anyway. Thank you to the Red MG for your cameo. And there we are then, guys. That's all we got time for this week. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you liked the video. If you did, there is of course a button specifically for that, and if you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so. That would be wicked sweet awesome. Enjoy the rest of your week, whatever it is you get up to. My name's John. You've been watching Auto Shenanigans, and I'll see you guys next time for another exciting Great British Road Journey. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.